Racist restaurant owner denies entry to black family. They return as new owners. The glass of wine shattered against the wall, red liquid streaming down like blood over the framed black and white photographs of Millbrook's historic downtown. Walter Gibson's face was contorted with rage, his finger pointing at the stunned black family standing just inside the entrance of the Heritage Room. "I told you people to get out," Walter shouted, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent restaurant. "We don't serve your kind here." Margaret Freeman stood frozen, her hand gripping her teenage son Michael's shoulder so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her husband James moved protectively in front of them, his body tense but his voice measured. "We have a reservation," James said calmly, though his eyes burned with controlled fury. "We're here to celebrate my mother's 75th birthday." Elderly Doris Freeman, dressed in her Sunday best with a small corsage pinned to her jacket, looked on with quiet dignity despite the humiliation burning in her eyes. "I don't care if it's the Queen of England's birthday," Walter sneered, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. "This is my restaurant and I decide who eats here." The other diners sat in uncomfortable silence, some looking away in shame, others watching with morbid fascination. A few staff members shifted uneasily behind the bar. "Mr. Gibson," a soft voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see Elena Vasquez, the restaurant's head chef, stepping out from the kitchen, her white coat immaculate despite the dinner rush. "These people have a reservation. I prepared the special table myself." Walter's face darkened even more. "Get back in the kitchen, Elena. This isn't your concern." Elena didn't move. "Walter, please, this isn't right." "You work for me," Walter hissed, "and I'm telling you, not anymore." Elena untied her apron and dropped it on the nearest table. "I quit." That's when the side door opened, and in walked Catherine Gibson, Walter's daughter, returning from her evening class at the community college. She stopped, taking in the scene with growing horror. "Dad, what's happening?" Walter turned to his daughter, momentarily disarmed. "Catherine, go upstairs. This doesn't concern you." Catherine's gaze moved from her father to the Freeman family, to Elena, and then to the broken glass on the floor. Understanding dawned on her face, followed by a wave of shame. "No," she said quietly. "I think it does concern me." She walked over to the Freeman family and stood beside them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Walter stared at his daughter, betrayal and rage battling across his features. "Catherine," he warned, "don't you dare—" "Actually, Dad," Catherine interrupted, her voice growing stronger, "there's something you should know." She took a deep breath and looked directly at James Freeman. "Mr. Freeman is my business professor at the college, and as of this morning—" She reached into her bag and pulled out a document. "He's also your new landlord." The restaurant fell completely silent, but let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when the Freeman family was getting ready for what they thought would be a special evening. James Freeman adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror while his wife Margaret put the finishing touches on her makeup. After 27 years of marriage, they still moved around each other with practiced ease, a choreographed dance of domestic harmony. "Mom's so excited about tonight," James said, smiling at his wife's reflection. "She hasn't stopped talking about trying the Heritage Room since they renovated last year." Margaret nodded, applying a touch of lipstick. "She deserves this celebration, James. 75 years and still sharp as a tack." Their son Michael appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in his dress shirt and tie. At 17, he was at that age where everything seemed like a burden, but even he recognized the importance of his grandmother's birthday. "Do I have to wear this tie?" he asked, tugging at the knot. "It feels like it's choking me." James chuckled. "Yes, you do. The Heritage Room is the fanciest restaurant in Millbrook. Your grandmother deserves our best." Michael sighed, but stopped fidgeting with the tie. "Fine. But only because it's for Grandma." Downstairs, Doris Freeman sat patiently in the living room, dressed in her finest outfit, a powder blue dress suit with a delicate pearl necklace that had been a gift from her late husband. On her lapel was a small corsage of white roses that Michael had surprised her with earlier. "Don't you all look wonderful?" she said as the family came downstairs. Her eyes twinkled with delight. "I feel like a queen today." James bent down to kiss his mother's cheek. "You are a queen, Mom, the queen of our family." Doris patted his hand. "Such a sweet boy. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become." A shadow passed over James's face at the mention of his father, who had passed away 5 years ago. William Freeman had been a pillar in Millbrook's black community, the first African-American to open a successful business in the downtown area back in the 1960s. Freeman's Hardware had been a neighborhood institution for decades until James made the difficult decision to sell the property after his father's death. "I wish Dad could be here," James said softly. "He is here," Doris replied, touching her heart. "Right here." Margaret checked her watch. We should get going. Our reservation is for 7:00, and you know how traffic gets around downtown. The family piled into James's sedan, a recent purchase that he was particularly proud of. As they drove through the streets of Millbrook, they passed Freeman's Hardware, now converted into an artisanal coffee shop. James felt the familiar pang of regret as they passed, but he had made peace with his decision. The hardware business had been struggling for years, and the offer from the development company had been too good to refuse. What James hadn't told his family yet was that he had been working on a new venture. As a business professor at Millbrook Community College, he had been saving and investing wisely, building up capital for something special. Earlier that day, he had finalized the purchase of the building that housed the Heritage Room, one of several properties sold by a retiring real estate investor. The restaurant had a long-term lease, so nothing would change immediately, but James liked the idea of owning a piece of downtown Millbrook again. They arrived at the Heritage Room 15 minutes before their reservation. The restaurant occupied a historic building on Main Street, its brick facade and large windows illuminated by tasteful exterior lighting. A valet approached as they pulled up. "Good evening, sir," the young man said, opening the door for Doris first. James handed over his keys and helped his mother out of the car. The family approached the restaurant's entrance, where a small brass plaque declared the Heritage Room S 1945. What the plaque didn't mention was that for most of its history, the restaurant had catered exclusively to white clientele. It was only in the last decade, under new management, that the establishment had officially welcomed all customers. Or so they thought. As they entered the elegant foyer with its polished wood and vintage photographs of Millbrook's past, a host approached them. He was a young man with slick-back hair and a practiced smile that faltered slightly as he took in the Freeman family. "Good evening," he said, his voice hesitant. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," James replied confidently. "Freeman party of 4 at 7:00. The host consulted his book, flipping through pages longer than necessary. "I'm not seeing it," he finally said. "Are you sure it was for tonight?" Margaret stepped forward. "I made the reservation myself 3 weeks ago. I spoke with someone named Ashley. She confirmed it just yesterday when I called." The host looked uncomfortable. "Let me check with the manager." He disappeared into the restaurant, leaving the family waiting in the foyer. Minutes passed. Other guests arrived, were greeted, and promptly seated. "This doesn't feel right," Michael muttered to his father. James placed a calming hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's give them the benefit of the doubt." Finally, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit approached. He had salt and pepper hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold look in his eyes. This was Walter Gibson, the owner of the Heritage Room for the past 5 years. "Is there a problem?" James asked as Walter approached. "I'm afraid there is," Walter replied, not bothering to introduce himself. "We have no record of your reservation and we're fully booked tonight." James frowned. "My wife confirmed the reservation yesterday. We're celebrating my mother's 75th birthday." He gestured to Doris, who stood with quiet dignity despite the growing tension. Walter's gaze flickered briefly to Doris, then back to James. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. Perhaps you misunderstood. We're fully committed this evening." Just then, a white couple entered the restaurant. Without checking any reservation book, the host who had previously helped the Freemans immediately smiled and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, welcome back. Your table is ready." The contrast was not lost on the Freeman family. "I see," James said slowly, his suspicions confirmed. "So it's not about reservations at all, is it?" Walter's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're implying, but I suggest you find somewhere else to dine tonight." Margaret placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "James," she said softly, "let's just go." But James Freeman had not raised a son to back down from injustice. "No," he said firmly. "We made a reservation. We confirmed that reservation. We're here to celebrate my mother's birthday, and we're not leaving until we're seated." Walter's face flushed with anger. "I own this restaurant, and I decide who eats here. Now I'm asking you politely to leave before there's a scene." "There's already a scene," Michael said, his young voice steady despite his nervousness. "You're making one right now." "Michael," Margaret cautioned, but there was a hint of pride in her voice. By now, other diners were watching the confrontation. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few seemed uncomfortably aware of what was happening. "Walter," a woman's voice called from inside the restaurant. "What's going on?" Elena Vasquez, the head chef of the Heritage Room, emerged from the kitchen. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had worked her way up from dishwasher to chef over decades in the restaurant industry. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her white chef's coat was pristine despite the dinner service underway. "Nothing that concerns you, Alina," Walter said tersely. "Get back to the kitchen." Alina's eyes took in the Freeman family, noting Doris's corsage and their formal attire. Understanding dawned on her face. "Are these the Freemans? I prepared the special corner table myself with the birthday candle for the dessert." Walter's jaw tightened. "There's been a misunderstanding. They don't have a reservation." "But Ashley told me," Alina began. "Ashley made a mistake," Walter interrupted. "Now please return to your duties." Alina didn't move. Instead, she turned to the Freemans. "Mrs. Freeman," she said, addressing Doris, "I prepared a special dessert for your birthday, a chocolate souffle with raspberry sauce. Ashley mentioned it was your favorite." Doris's eyes brightened. "That's very kind of you, dear. It is indeed my favorite." Walter stepped between Alina and the family. "That's enough, Alina. These people were just leaving." James's patience finally snapped. "These people, I'm a respected professor at Millbrook Community College. My mother worked as a nurse in this town for 40 years. My wife runs the literacy program at the public library, and my son is the top student in his class. We're not these people. We're the Freemans, and we had a reservation." "I don't care who you are," Walter replied, his voice rising. "This is my restaurant, and I make the rules." "Rules that apparently change depending on the color of someone's skin," James said, his voice controlled but intense. That's when Walter lost his composure. He grabbed a half-full glass of red wine from a nearby server's tray and hurled it against the wall, the liquid spattering across the framed photographs. "I told you people to get out," Walter shouted, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent restaurant. "We don't serve your kind here." From there, the scene played out as we witnessed at the beginning, Alina quitting on the spot, Catherine arriving and revealing that James was not only her professor, but now Walter's landlord. Walter stared at the document in Catherine's hand, disbelief written across his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Catherine's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Professor Freeman purchased this building from Mr. Harrington this morning. He owns the property now." A murmur ran through the restaurant. Several diners exchanged glances, and one couple quietly asked for their check. "That's impossible," Walter sputtered. "Harrington would have told me if he was selling." "He tried," James said calmly. "According to him, he called you 3 times in the past month to give you the opportunity to buy the building yourself. You never returned his calls." Walter's face flushed deeper. He remembered the calls but had dismissed them, assuming old Harrington just wanted to raise the rent again. "This doesn't change anything," Walter insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I have a 15-year lease." "Yes, you do," James agreed, "as long as you operate within the terms of that lease, one of which prohibits discriminatory practices." For the first time, uncertainty crept into Walter's expression. "You can't prove anything." "Actually," Alina interjected, "I can." She pulled out her phone. "I've been documenting every incident for the past year. Every time you told me to seat certain guests in the back. Every time you mysteriously lost reservations for people with foreign-sounding names. Every time you rushed black customers through their meals." Walter's gaze darted around the restaurant, taking in the shocked expressions of his staff and patrons. His eyes finally landed on his daughter, who looked back at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "Catherine," he pleaded, "you don't understand. This restaurant is our heritage, our legacy." "Whose heritage, Dad?" Catherine asked quietly. "The photos on these walls tell the story of Millbrook, but only part of it. Where are the pictures of Mr. Freeman's father, who ran a business downtown for 40 years? Where are the people who built this town alongside your grandfather?" Walter had no answer. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Catherine turned to the Freeman family. "Mrs. Freeman," she said, addressing Doris, "I believe we have a table ready for you, the best one in the house." Alina nodded in agreement. "And your chocolate souffle is timed to perfection for after your meal." Walter watched in stunned silence as Catherine and Alina led the Freeman family to the corner table, the one with the best view of Main Street. Other diners avoided Walter's gaze, some whispering among themselves, others focusing intently on their meals. Left alone in the entrance, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: shame. It crept up his neck and settled heavily on his shoulders as he watched his daughter interact warmly with the Freeman family, pulling out Doris's chair and ensuring she was comfortable. Walter retreated to his office at the back of the restaurant, closing the door behind him. He sat heavily in his leather chair, the events of the evening playing through his mind. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? His eyes fell on a photograph on his desk, his father and grandfather standing proudly in front of the Heritage Room in 1968. The year had significance that Walter had never fully acknowledged. It was the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the year of civil rights protests across America. While those events unfolded, the Heritage Room had remained a bastion of segregation in practice if not in policy, serving their own kind, as his grandfather used to say. Walter had grown up with those values seeping into his consciousness. His father had been slightly more progressive but still maintained the character of the restaurant as he called it. When Walter took over 5 years ago, he simply continued the unspoken traditions, believing he was preserving something important. Now, with his daughter's words echoing in his mind, he began to see the Heritage Room through different eyes. Whose heritage was he really preserving? Meanwhile, in the dining room, the Freeman family settled into their table. The initial upset of the confrontation still lingered, but Doris, ever the matriarch, set the tone. "Well," she said, smoothing her napkin over her lap, "I've waited 75 years to dine at the Heritage Room. A little drama isn't going to spoil my birthday." James couldn't help but smile at his mother's resilience. "Mom, I'm sorry about what happened." Doris waved away his concern. "I've seen worse, son, much worse. When I was a girl, we couldn't even walk through the front door of a place like this. At least we're seated now." She looked around appreciatively at the elegant surroundings. "And it is a beautiful restaurant." Alina personally brought out their appetizers, delicate crab cakes with a spicy remoulade sauce. "On the house," she said with a warm smile. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Freeman." As Alina returned to the kitchen, Catherine approached their table, her expression still troubled. "I want to apologize for my father's behavior," she said. "There's no excuse for it." "No," James agreed, "there isn't, but you're not responsible for your father's actions." Catherine twisted her hands together nervously. "Professor Freeman, I didn't know about how things were done here. I'm away at college most of the time, and when I'm home, I'm usually studying upstairs in our apartment." "Catherine," Margaret said gently, "the fact that you stood up to your father says a lot about you." "That takes courage." "Not as much courage as what you deal with," Catherine replied. "I'm taking your social justice seminar this semester, Mrs. Freeman. The things we're reading about, the discussions we're having, they've opened my eyes, but I never thought I'd see it so clearly in my own family." James studied the young woman thoughtfully. "Catherine, how much do you know about your father's business?" "Not much," she admitted. "Dad always said the restaurant business wasn't meant for me. He expected me to go to law school after college." "And is that what you want?" Catherine hesitated. "I used to think so, but lately, I've been more interested in business. Actually, your class is my favorite this semester, Professor." James nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "Would you like to join us? I think there's some business we could discuss." Catherine glanced back toward her father's office, then made her decision. "Yes, I would, thank you." She pulled up a chair, and for the next hour, as they enjoyed their meal, James explained his vision for the building and potentially the restaurant itself. He hadn't planned to get involved in the restaurant business, but the events of the evening had shown him that there was more at stake than just property ownership. "The Heritage Room has a long history in Millbrook," James explained. "But it's a complicated history, as we've seen tonight. What if it could become something that truly celebrates the heritage of everyone in our community?" Catherine's eyes lit up with interest. "What are you suggesting?" "A partnership, perhaps," James said. "The restaurant industry is difficult. Your father has experience that would be valuable, but the culture of the place needs to change." "Dad would never agree to that," Catherine said, shaking her head. "Not after tonight." "People can surprise you," Doris interjected. "Sometimes, when they're confronted with their own failings, they find a way to grow. Or they double down and get worse," Michael added skeptically. In the kitchen, Alina was preparing Doris's birthday dessert, the promised chocolate soufflé with raspberry sauce. As she worked, she thought about the evening's events and her impulsive decision to quit. For 10 years, she had worked her way up from line cook to head chef at the Heritage Room. The restaurant had become her life, her passion, her creative outlet. Walking away wouldn't be easy, but watching Walter's treatment of the Freeman family had been the final straw after years of small compromises and looking the other way. Alina had immigrated from Mexico as a child, and though her family had faced their share of discrimination, she had always believed that hard work and talent would win out in the end. At the Heritage Room, her culinary skills had indeed earned her the top position in the kitchen, but Walter's prejudices had created an environment that no longer aligned with her values. As she put the finishing touches on the soufflé, adding a single candle as requested, Walter appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "You quit, remember?" Alina straightened her shoulders. "I'm finishing Mrs. Freeman's birthday dessert, then I'll go. Those people are still here." Walter's face darkened again. "Yes, Walter, they are, and they're enjoying the meal that your restaurant is known for, the meal that my team and I created." She gestured to the other kitchen staff who were watching the exchange warily. These people make the Heritage Room what it is, not the building, not the name, and certainly not your attitude. Walter stepped closer, lowering his voice. Alina, we've worked together for years. Don't throw that away over one misunderstanding. Alina laughed without humor. Misunderstanding. You threw a glass at the wall and told them you don't serve their kind. What part of that was misunderstood? Walter had no answer, but his expression showed that Alina's words had hit home. You know, Alina continued, softening her tone slightly, my grandmother had a saying, La comida no conoce color, food knows no color. When people sit down to a good meal, differences fade away. That's what I've always believed in as a chef. Creating experiences that bring people together, not drive them apart. She turned back to the soufflé, adding a delicate chocolate curl as a final garnish. I'll bring this out myself, and then I'll collect my things. Walter watched her go, then retreated once more to his office. As he sat down, his eyes again fell on the photograph of his father and grandfather. For the first time, he noticed something in the background of the image, a black man walking past the restaurant, his eyes downcast, clearly unwelcome in the establishment his own family now sat in. Time seemed to slow as Walter absorbed this detail he had overlooked for years. How many others had been turned away, made to feel less than, denied service in the name of heritage? A light knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Catherine entered without waiting for a response. Dad, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, we need to talk. Walter looked up at his daughter, seeing for the first time how much she had grown and changed in the 3 years she had been away at college. No longer the compliant teenager who had accepted his word as law, but a young woman with her own thoughts and principles. I suppose we do, he agreed. Catherine sat down across from him. Professor Freeman has a proposition for you. I'm not interested in anything that man has to say, Walter said automatically, but there was no real conviction in his voice. I think you should listen, Catherine insisted, because you're about to lose everything, Dad, not just the restaurant, but me too. Walter's head snapped up. What are you talking about? I can't be part of this anymore, Catherine said, gesturing vaguely to encompass the restaurant and everything it represented. The way you treated that family tonight. It made me ashamed to be your daughter. The words hit Walter like a physical blow. Catherine was all he had left after his wife had died of cancer 5 years ago. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Catherine, he began, his voice breaking slightly, you don't understand. This restaurant is our family's legacy. It's all I have to give you. I don't want this legacy, Dad, not if it comes with the kind of hatred I saw tonight. Walter fell silent, the weight of his daughter's words settling heavily on him. But, Catherine continued, Professor Freeman has an idea that might save the restaurant and give it a new purpose. He's willing to talk to you if you're willing to listen. Walter stared at his daughter for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Bring him in. When James Freeman entered Walter's office a few minutes later, the tension between the two men was palpable. They sized each other up across the desk, decades of history and prejudice standing between them. Mr. Gibson, James began formally, I want to be clear about something. What happened tonight was unacceptable and potentially illegal under civil rights laws. Walter's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. As your new landlord, James continued, I have grounds to terminate your lease based on discriminatory practices, but that's not why I'm here. Why are you here, then? Walter asked. Because I believe in second chances, James replied. And because your daughter cares about you despite her disappointment in your actions tonight. Walter glanced at Catherine, who stood beside James, and saw the truth of this statement in her eyes. What exactly are you proposing? Walter asked cautiously. James laid out his vision, a transformation of the Heritage Room into a restaurant that truly celebrated the diverse heritage of Millbrook. A place where the walls would display photographs of all the people who had built the community, where the menu would reflect various cultural influences, and where everyone would be welcomed with respect. The Heritage Room could become a model for inclusive business practices, James explained, a place that honors the past while embracing a better future. And where do I fit into this vision? Walter asked, his tone guarded. That depends on you, James replied honestly. I'm not a restaurateur. I'm a business professor with capital to invest. The restaurant needs someone with experience to run the day-to-day operations. That could be you if you're willing to change. Walter leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. And if I refuse, then I'll find someone else, James said simply. Alina has 15 years of experience in the industry. She knows the business inside and out. The mention of Alina struck a chord with Walter. He had relied on her talents for years, taking credit for much of the restaurant's culinary success while paying her considerably less than a male chef would have earned. Why would you offer me this chance? Walter asked, genuine confusion in his voice. After what happened tonight? James took a moment before answering. Because holding on to bitterness doesn't help anyone move forward. My father taught me that. He faced discrimination his entire life but never let it harden his heart. William Freeman, Walter said softly, recognition dawning on his face. You're William Freeman's son. James nodded, surprised. You knew my father. Walter's gaze dropped to the desk. Everyone in downtown Millbrook knew William Freeman. He helped my father once. There was a fire next door to the restaurant in '78. Your father brought his employees over with extinguishers before the fire department even arrived. Probably saved this building. James hadn't heard this story before, and it touched him to learn this new connection to his father. My dad refused to let him thank him properly, Walter continued. Wouldn't let a black man sit at our tables even after he helped save the place. Shame colored Walter's words. I was 12. I remember thinking it didn't make sense. And yet you continued the same practices, James observed, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. Walter had no defense. I did, he admitted. I told myself it was tradition, that I was honoring my father and grandfather. But tonight, seeing it through Catherine's eyes, through your family's eyes, I can't justify it anymore. The admission seemed to physically affect Walter. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, James saw past the bigoted restaurant owner to the man beneath, flawed, fearful, but perhaps not beyond redemption. I need time to think, Walter finally said. James nodded. Take the week. But know that changes are coming, with or without you. In the dining room, Doris Freeman's birthday celebration was drawing to a close. Alina had brought out the chocolate souffle with a single candle, and the surrounding tables had joined in singing Happy Birthday. For a brief moment, the earlier ugliness was forgotten as Doris closed her eyes, made a wish, and blew out her candle to applause from fellow diners. As they prepared to leave, Alina approached their table once more. Mrs. Freeman, she said warmly, I hope, despite everything, that you enjoyed your meal. It was wonderful, dear, Doris assured her. Best souffle I've had in 75 years, Alina smiled. That's high praise, thank you. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry about earlier, that's not what the Heritage Room should be. No, Margaret agreed, it's not, but perhaps it could become something better. Michael, who had been quiet for much of the evening, processing the events in his own way, suddenly spoke up. Ms. Vasquez, do you think places like this can really change? Or are some things too broken to fix? It was a profound question from the teenager, revealing his own struggle to reconcile the evening's events with his understanding of the world. Alina considered her answer carefully. I believe that anything made by people can be remade by people if there's enough will to change. This restaurant is just walls and tables and food. What matters is the heart behind it. Michael nodded thoughtfully. I want to believe that's true. As the Freeman family prepared to leave, James and Catherine returned from Walter's office. Catherine looked emotionally drained but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. How did it go? Margaret asked her husband quietly. As well as could be expected, James replied. We've given him something to think about, at least. The family thanked Alina once more and made their way to the exit. As they reached the door, Walter emerged from his office. The restaurant fell silent as he approached the Freeman family. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then Walter did something unexpected. He extended his hand to Doris. Mrs. Freeman, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I want to apologize for ruining your birthday celebration. There's no excuse for my behavior. Doris looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then accepted it with the grace that had defined her 75 years of life. Apology accepted, Mr. Gibson, though I believe you owe one to your chef as well. Walter nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. I do, to Alina and to many others. Apologies are just words, Michael said, unable to contain himself. What matters is what comes next. Walter met the young man's gaze, recognizing the challenge there. You're right, words. He turned to James. Mr. Freeman, I'd like to continue our conversation tomorrow if you're willing. I think it's time for some changes around here. James nodded. Tomorrow then, 10 a.m. at my office at the college. As the Freeman family finally left the restaurant, the tension of the evening began to dissipate. In the car, driving home, they processed what had happened. Well, Margaret said with a small laugh, that wasn't quite the birthday celebration we planned. No, Doris agreed. It was much more eventful, though the souffle was divine. James glanced at his mother in the rearview mirror, marveling at her ability to find light in even the darkest situations. Mom, I'm so sorry about how you were treated. Don't be sorry, James, Doris replied firmly. Be effective, that's what your father always said. It sounds like you've got a plan to be just that. I didn't plan any of this, James admitted. Buying the building was an investment decision. I never imagined I'd be considering a partnership with Walter Gibson of all people. Life takes unexpected turns, Doris observed. Sometimes painful ones, but often that pain leads to growth. In the passenger seat, Margaret reached over to squeeze her husband's hand. Do you really think Walter can change? James sighed. I don't know, but I believe people deserve the chance to try. From the back seat, Michael spoke up. Dad, if you do this, if you work with Mr. Gibson, I want to be involved. James glanced at his son in surprise. You do, Michael nodded, unusually serious. I want to see what happens when someone like him is forced to confront someone like us as equals. I want to understand if people can really change. It's not an experiment, son, James cautioned. It's a business. It's both, Michael insisted. And it's important. James couldn't argue with that. What had begun as a simple birthday dinner had evolved into something far more significant, a potential turning point not just for the Gibson and Freeman families, but perhaps for Millbrook itself. The next morning, Walter arrived at James's office precisely at 10 a.m. He looked like he hadn't slept much, his usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled. Catherine accompanied him, having insisted on being part of the conversation. James welcomed them into his modest office at Millbrook Community College, where certificates and awards covered one wall and family photographs adorned another. Walter's eyes lingered on a picture of William Freeman standing proudly in front of his hardware store. Thank you for coming, James began, gesturing for them to sit. I appreciate your willingness to continue our discussion. Walter nodded stiffly. I've been thinking about your proposal all night, about a lot of things, actually. And? James prompted when Walter fell silent. And I'm interested, Walter finally said. But I have conditions of my own. James leaned back in his chair. I'm listening. If we do this, transform the Heritage Room, I want to maintain some connection to its history, not the discriminatory practices, he added quickly, but the culinary traditions, the atmosphere that made it special to so many in the community. That's reasonable, James agreed. The goal isn't to erase history, but to expand it to make it more inclusive. Walter seemed relieved at this concession. I also want to ensure Catherine has a place in the business if she wants it. I always assumed she wouldn't be interested, but... I am interested, Dad, Catherine interjected. I always have been, you just never asked. Walter looked at his daughter with regret. I'm asking now. James observed the exchange thoughtfully. Actually, I was hoping Catherine might consider an internship as part of her business degree. The restaurant could be a case study in business transformation. Catherine's eyes lit up. I'd love that, Professor Freeman. For the first time since the previous evening, Walter smiled slightly. She gets her business sense from her mother. Corinne always knew the financial side of the restaurant better than I did. The mention of his late wife seemed to soften Walter further. Corinne would be ashamed of how I've been running things. She always wanted to make changes, to modernize not just the menu but the atmosphere. I was the one who insisted on tradition. James recognized an opening. Perhaps this is a chance to honor her vision as well. Walter nodded slowly. Perhaps it is. He straightened in his chair. There's one more thing, Alina. I need to make things right with her. That's between you and Alina, James said. But yes, if this partnership is going to work, she would be a crucial part of it. She might not want to work with me anymore, Walter acknowledged, and I wouldn't blame her. Let's find out, James suggested. I invited her to join us at 10:30. As if on cue, there was a knock at the office door. Alina entered, looking somewhat uncomfortable but composed. She had clearly dressed carefully for this meeting, wearing a professional blazer over a simple blouse rather than her chef's whites. Professor Freeman, she greeted James, then nodded to the others. Catherine, Walter. Thank you for coming, Alina, James said, offering her a seat. We've been discussing the future of the Heritage Room. Alina's expression revealed nothing. And what have you decided? James glanced at Walter, indicating that he should take the lead. Walter cleared his throat. Nothing is decided yet, but we, he corrected, looking at Catherine, are exploring a partnership with Professor Freeman. A transformation of the restaurant into something more inclusive, more representative of Millbrook's diverse community. Alina raised an eyebrow. That's quite a change from last night. Yes, Walter admitted, it is. Why the sudden conversion? Alina asked skeptically. Walter looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. Part necessity, part revelation, I suppose, seeing my behavior through Catherine's eyes, remembering things I'd chosen to forget. He paused. And knowing that the alternative is losing everything. Alina studied him for a long moment. At least you're honest about that part. Alina, Walter continued, I owe you an apology for last night and for many things before that. The way I've treated you, the credit I've taken for your work, the disparity in your compensation compared to your predecessors. Alina's expression softened slightly at this unexpectedly comprehensive apology. I appreciate that, Walter. But apologies don't change the past. No, Walter agreed, they don't, but they can be the first step toward a different future. He took a deep breath. I'd like you to stay on as head chef, with full creative control of the menu and a salary commensurate with your experience and talents. Alina looked surprised. Full creative control? You've never been willing to consider that before. Things are changing, Walter said simply. Alina turned to James. And you? What's your role in all this? James outlined his vision for the partnership, Walter's operational experience combined with new capital investment and a completely revised approach to the restaurant's image and culture. It sounds promising, Alina admitted when he finished. But I'd need assurances that the changes would be more than superficial. That's why I'm here, Catherine interjected. I'll be working on this as part of my business degree, documenting the transformation. Everything will be transparent. Alina considered this. I have some conditions of my own. Name them, James encouraged. First, I want to bring back Ashley, the hostess who was fired last month for seating that Indian family at a prominent table against Walter's instructions. Walter winced but nodded his agreement. Second, Alina continued, I want to create an apprenticeship program for young people from all backgrounds who are interested in the culinary arts. Millbrook Community College has a hospitality program, yes. It does, James confirmed. That could be an excellent partnership opportunity. And third, Alina said, looking directly at Walter, I want a formal policy of zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind toward staff or customers written into the business plan and prominently displayed in the restaurant. Walter hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Yes to all three. Alina's expression remained guarded. I want to believe this can work, but it won't be easy. There's a lot of history to overcome. History doesn't have to dictate the future, James said quietly. My father's hardware store is now a coffee shop. Businesses change, communities evolve. What matters is whether we're willing to be part of that evolution or fight against it. The four of them continued their discussion for another hour, laying the groundwork for what would become a transformative partnership. By the end, there was cautious optimism in the room, a sense that something meaningful might emerge from the previous night's ugliness. As they prepared to leave, Walter turned to James with one final question. Why are you really doing this? You could simply evict me, find a new tenant, avoid all this complication. James considered the question carefully. When I sold my father's hardware store after he died, I felt like I was letting go of his legacy. It took time for me to realize that his true legacy wasn't the building or the business. It was the values he lived by and taught me. Integrity, perseverance, forgiveness. This partnership is a chance to honor those values in a way that might actually create more lasting change than simply forcing you out. Walter nodded slowly, accepting this answer. Your father was a better man than mine, it seems. Maybe, James allowed. Or maybe yours just never had the opportunity to become his best self. Sometimes people need to be challenged to grow. 3 months later, the Heritage Room closed for renovations. When it reopened 6 weeks after that, it bore a new name, Freeman and Gibson's Heritage Table. The interior had been redesigned to showcase photographs and artifacts from all of Millbrook's communities, Black, White, Hispanic, Asian, telling a more complete story of the town's development. The menu, under Alina's direction, featured traditional Southern cuisine alongside dishes that reflected Millbrook's evolving demographics. The apprenticeship program had begun with 6 students from the community college, representing diverse backgrounds and experiences. On opening night, Doris Freeman was given the honor of cutting the ribbon. At 75, she stood tall and proud, her son and family beside her, as she addressed the gathered crowd. When I was a girl, she began, her voice strong despite her years, I couldn't have imagined standing here today. The doors of this establishment were closed to people who looked like me, but tonight we celebrate not just the opening of a restaurant, but the opening of minds and hearts. She turned to Walter, who stood somewhat uncomfortably beside her. Change isn't easy. It requires courage to admit when we've been wrong and even more courage to do better. Tonight, we acknowledge that courage. Walter, moved by her words, stepped forward. Mrs. Freeman is too generous. The courage has been all hers and her family's in offering a second chance to someone who didn't deserve it. He looked out at the diverse crowd gathered for the opening. This restaurant has stood on this corner for 75 years, as long as Mrs. Freeman has lived in Millbrook. For too much of that time, it failed to serve all of our community. Today marks a new beginning. James watched the exchange with a sense of cautious optimism. The past 3 months had not been easy. There had been setbacks and arguments, moments when the partnership seemed on the verge of collapse. Walter's ingrained attitudes didn't disappear overnight, and James had struggled with his own doubts about whether the venture could succeed. But standing there, watching his mother cut the ribbon to officially open Freeman and Gibson's heritage table, James felt a sense of rightness about their difficult journey. The restaurant that had once denied service to his family was now partly theirs, transformed into a space that celebrated rather than excluded. Michael, now working part-time at the restaurant while finishing his senior year of high school, joined his father. "Do you think it will last?" he asked quietly. "This change?" James put an arm around his son's shoulders. "I don't know. Change is never guaranteed to be permanent, but it's always possible, and that possibility is worth working for." As the doors opened and guests began to enter, Alina directed her staff with quiet confidence. Catherine greeted customers alongside a reinstated Ashley, both of them embodying the new welcoming spirit of the establishment. Walter, standing somewhat apart from the others, caught James's eye across the room. Something passed between the two men, not quite friendship, but a mutual acknowledgement of the journey they had embarked on together. It was Doris who finally bridged the remaining gap, approaching Walter with her hand extended once more. "Mr. Gibson," she said warmly, "I believe we have a reservation this time." Walter managed a smile as he took her hand. "Yes, Mrs. Freeman, the best table in the house, just as it should have been from the beginning." And as the Freeman and Gibson families sat down together for their first meal in the newly transformed restaurant, it felt like the beginning of something important, not just for them, but for Millbrook itself. A small step toward healing old wounds and creating a community where heritage truly meant the contributions and experiences of everyone. Now, back to where we started. The shattered wine glass had long since been cleaned up, the stain on the wall painted over. In its place hung a new photograph, William Freeman and Walter's father standing side by side outside the building in 1978, after the fire that nearly destroyed it. A moment of connection that had been forgotten but was now remembered and honored. The heritage room was gone, but something better had taken its place. A restaurant where food brought people together rather than kept them apart, where the true heritage of Millbrook, all of it, was celebrated. As Doris Freeman enjoyed her chocolate soufflé once again, this time without tension or conflict, she smiled at her family gathered around her. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "your father used to say that the measure of a community isn't how it treats its most privileged members, but how it includes those who have been excluded." James nodded, his father's wisdom still guiding him after all these years. He was right, and sometimes inclusion starts with something as simple as a seat at the table. Walter, overhearing this as he passed by, stopped briefly. "And sometimes," he added quietly, "it takes someone brave enough to claim that seat even when others try to deny it." He met Doris's gaze with genuine respect. "Thank you for not giving up that night. It would have been easier, but then, none of this would have happened." As Walter moved on to greet other guests, Margaret squeezed her husband's hand under the table. "You did it, James. You turned something ugly into something beautiful." James shook his head. "We all did it. Walter had to be willing to change. Alina had to be willing to stay. Catherine had to be brave enough to stand up to her father. And Mom." He smiled at Doris. "Mom had to show us all what dignity looks like in the face of discrimination." Michael, who had been listening to the conversation, raised his water glass. "To Grandma," he said. "Happy 75th birthday, a few months late, but worth the wait." They all raised their glasses in a toast as Alina brought out a surprise, another chocolate soufflé, this one with 75 tiny candles arranged in a heart shape. "Make a wish, Mrs. Freeman," Alina said with a smile. Doris looked around the table at her family, then at the diverse crowd enjoying their meals throughout the restaurant. Her eyes moistened slightly as she took in the scene, something she had never thought to witness in her lifetime. "I don't need to wish for anything," she said softly. "It's already come true. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.